There is a generation that grew up learning to be realistic about money. Not negative, just realistic. A generation that watched traditional pensions evaporate from beneath their parents and entered adulthood during recessions that nobody warned them were coming. They built something through their 20s, watched Black Monday and the dot-com collapse, and the Great Recession systematically dismantle their confidence in the financial system, and quietly arrived at a conclusion that felt completely reasonable given everything they had witnessed. Real wealth was for someone else, not for people like them. Gen X was perhaps the most financially skeptical generation in modern American history, and every single one of those doubts was earned through lived experience. So here is the question that deserves a real answer. If Gen X spent decades believing that becoming a millionaire was nearly impossible for an ordinary working person, how did so many ordinary Gen X families quietly get there anyway? Because they did, by the millions. And most of them have no idea their story is even worth telling. There are 24 million millionaire households in America right now, almost 1 in every 5. Not hedge fund managers or tech founders or people who inherited the right last name. The mechanic who has been at the same shop since 1998. The public school teacher who never crossed $65,000 in a single year. The couple from the neighborhood who drove the same sensible car for 11 years and never once mentioned their retirement balance at a backyard gathering. 1/3 of those 24 million households did not exist 8 years ago. They were built recently, steadily, by people who kept contributing through every market cycle that gave them a rational reason to stop. And the engine behind most of those stories was something Gen X was handed almost by accident at exactly the right moment in history, even if nobody sat down and explained it to them properly when it arrived. Meet Steve. Steve was born in 1971. He entered the workforce during a recession, spent his 20s navigating corporate restructurings and layoffs that his parents never had to anticipate, watched the dot-com era briefly make certain people look like financial geniuses before it collapsed in 2000, and took a meaningful portion of his retirement account with it. Then, 2008 arrived, and repeated the entire experience at a larger scale. Steve earns $62,000 a year. He drives a car with a dent in the door he keeps meaning to fix. He packs his lunch because his generation learned early that small expenses accumulate in ways you regret. He is not bitter, he is practical. And if you asked him today whether he would ever become a millionaire, he would give you the same answer he has carried for 30 years. No, not with anger, just with certainty. Because Steve watched too many things fall apart to trust a story that sounds this clean. Before that belief gets dismantled, something fundamental needs correcting. The word millionaire carries an image Gen X absorbed during a very specific cultural era. The 1980s delivered a loud and consistent message about what wealth looked like, and it looked nothing like Steve's life. That image became the measuring stick, and against that measuring stick, $1 million felt like the entry fee to a world that was simply never designed for people earning ordinary salaries. Here is what that image obscured. $1 million does not place anyone inside the top 1%. That threshold requires closer to 11 million. 1 million today means a paid-off home and a retirement account that grew quietly in the background while its owner lived an entirely unremarkable financial life. The door Gen X imagined was locked and located in a neighborhood reserved for someone else is actually unlocked. Most of them just spent 4 decades walking past it because every financial experience they lived through taught them to assume otherwise. Now here is the first lie, the one that cost Gen X the most time. The belief that income determines the outcome, that if your paycheck never reached a certain level, the destination was already decided before you started. This conviction felt logical to a generation that watched executive compensation explode, while their own wages stagnated through repeated cycles of corporate restructuring. The visible gap between what the people at the top earned and what everyone else brought home reinforced a simple and deeply incorrect conclusion. That wealth was a function of how much you made, rather than how consistently you set aside a percentage of what you made. Steve earns $62,000 a year and does one single thing. He saves 15%. That is $775 monthly directed into his workplace retirement account. Because his employer matches a portion of that contribution, only around $500 actually leaves Steve's take-home pay. The remainder is employer match money that was sitting on the table for him, requiring nothing beyond a completed enrollment form. That money goes into a plain index fund. Not a stock selection, not a sector play, just a fund holding proportional shares of 500 large American companies that has averaged roughly 10% annually across the long run, through every crash Steve ever survived. He leaves it completely alone through market drops, recessions, and every alarming financial headline that arrives across 25 years. Starting at 30, Steve is a millionaire at 55. Same salary, same dented car, same lunch from home. He never did a single sophisticated thing with his money. That is actually the conservative version, calculated with his contribution held flat for the full 25 years. If Steve simply maintains that same 15% as his salary gradually increases over time, not becoming more aggressive, just refusing to let the percentage shrink under lifestyle pressure, he crosses the $1 million mark closer to 22 years. Full transparency on the numbers, because Gen X has been burned enough times by optimistic projections that buried the uncomfortable details. That account balance reflects nominal dollars. Inflation reduces its real purchasing power compared to what 1 million buys today. Adjusting for inflation using a 7% return assumption extends the timeline to around 31 years. That is the honest version. And here is what that honesty reveals. Whether the answer is 22 years, 25, or 31, an ordinary Gen X worker on an ordinary salary becomes a millionaire through an ordinary retirement account. The real-world data confirms it. The average person currently holding $1 million in a workplace retirement account is 59 years old and has been contributing consistently for about 26 years. That is not a projection. That is Steve's story already playing out in hundreds of thousands of real accounts held by real Gen X workers who kept going even when continuing felt pointless. The second belief is the one that actively cost Gen X money every time the market moved. The conviction that successful investing required expertise that ordinary people simply did not have. This belief was shaped deliberately by financial media that exploded into cable television during exactly the years Gen X was beginning to accumulate savings. Every program carried the same premise. The right information delivered at the right moment could help regular investors get ahead of the crowd. The dot-com era made this feel briefly true. And when the crash arrived, Gen X did not conclude that stock picking was never the strategy. They concluded the market was a trap built to extract money from people without inside access. That conclusion felt justified. It was not entirely accurate. Every panic sale locks in a loss that patient compounding would have eventually recovered. Every trend chase arrives late and exits early. Every repositioning creates a tax event that permanently removes a portion of the balance. The research on this is clear. During the last severe market downturn, only 5.5% of retirement account holders made any changes at all. 94 out of 100 sat completely still. That stillness is the actual strategy. The plain index fund requiring no expertise and no market timing will, across several decades, outperform almost every active approach. Not because it is sophisticated, because it removes the reactive human behavior that destroys returns every single time it activates. The third belief is the hardest to argue against because it was constructed from genuine experience. The belief that the system was designed to exclude people like them. Gen X was the first generation handed full personal responsibility for their own retirement after the pension model collapsed, given 401k plans with minimal instruction during their early working years, and told the outcome was now entirely up to them as individuals. They watched corporate loyalty disappear through restructurings that eliminated jobs and benefits simultaneously. They absorbed the savings and loan crisis, Black Monday, the dot-com implosion, and the Great Recession all within a single working lifetime. Each event reinforced the same message. Real wealth accumulation was for insiders. But 24 million millionaire households say otherwise. More than 650,000 of those millionaires built their wealth entirely through workplace retirement accounts, through payroll deductions, index funds, and time. These are Gen X workers who kept contributing through every downturn and arrived at their late 50s with balances that surprised even themselves. They did not find a way around the system. They used the part of it that was available to anyone willing to remain consistent long enough for it to work. 3 behavioral patterns broke the machine for the people who never reached that destination. Waiting, because every year of delay is not neutral ground, but lost compounding that cannot be recovered. Withdrawing, because every dollar removed from a compounding account during a layoff or medical emergency or moment of doubt takes decades of future growth with it. And lifestyle absorption, where income grew gradually, but the contribution percentage quietly eroded as expanded expenses swallowed the difference, producing producing years of income growth with zero improvement in retirement trajectory. None of those patterns required bad intentions to fall into. They were entirely predictable responses from a generation managing genuine financial turbulence while trying to make reasonable decisions under real pressure. Back to Steve one final time. Born 1971. $62,000 a year. A working life interrupted by recessions and restructurings and enough market crashes to make skepticism feel like wisdom. He was wrong about one thing. Not because his circumstances were secretly more favorable than he believed. He was wrong because his circumstances never needed to be anything other than what they already were. The salary was sufficient. The account was accessible. The 15% was small enough that daily life absorbed the absence without disruption. The machine only ever required a start date, a consistent habit, and the discipline to leave it alone through every chapter of financial history that tried to convince him stopping was the sensible choice. Gen X never believed becoming a millionaire would be easy. They were right. It was not easy. It was decades of steady behavior through circumstances that made steady behavior genuinely difficult. But easy and achievable have never been the same word. The crashes that scared so many away from the market entirely were also the periods that built the most wealth for the ones who stayed. Every downturn was a buying opportunity that patience would eventually reveal. Gen X did not need extraordinary income or perfect timing or insider access. They needed to keep going. The ones who did became millionaires, quietly, without celebration. In the same dented cars, with the same packed lunches, in the same ordinary neighborhoods where nobody had any idea what was growing in the background, while life just kept moving forward.